Hello, in this video I want to continue the conversation that we've been having about accelerationism and actually use this video in order to end a little bit off of that series. I think that this has been a really interesting series that I think will definitely become pertinent on the resolution, and I definitely think will if nothing else, be useful to shape a lot of the other conversations that I want to definitely have about like technology and various like theories and political philosophies about technology that I think will be really important for the upcoming water resolution as a whole. And so if you haven't, you should definitely check out the video before this one because it frames some of the priorities that we'll have going into finishing out this series when discussing how to answer affirmatives that are about accelerationism. But it's also important to get at least the info from the intro to accelerationism or maybe some of the other videos I've done to get a much fuller context of what we'll be talking about in this video in order to shape some of the conversations that we want to finish off having about the relationship that accelerationism has to criticisms, counterplans, and disads. I think when talking about how to make these strategies work really efficiently, it definitely requires you taking some of the advice that I talked about in the last video about like what types of case arguments you should be reading and the way that you should just generally thinking about what types of like points of contestation you should be trying to find against this in order to put together like a more full picture of like how I'll kind of be talking through some of the ways in which you should kind of go through these types of arguments and kind of identify portions of the flow that you think are particularly important, and hopefully that can kind of like shape the types of priorities that you take when you're trying to like configure your own strategy against this type of argument, even if it isn't like enough time for me to really work out the specifics of every possible argument that could be read against accelerationism in general. I think that when you're talking about criticism against accelerationism, it's really important first, like I said in the last video, to begin by talking about just how you want to frame the value of what debate does and what the particular debate that you're in is supposed to do in terms of how the judge should be evaluating it and what their ballot is supposed to do. I think that is extremely important against accelerationism, like I've said throughout this video series, to take your stance on futurity early. I think that if you want to have a debate about just the viability of futurity as a strategy as a whole, then I think that you should make a lot of arguments earlier on in the 1AC in order to really push that advantage, and for you to really set up the debate where the judges maybe only think about the viability of even what access to the future or the ability to kind of determine the future looks like, and then weighing your types of offense from there, which I don't think closes you in too tight because it still allows you to make really diverse sets of examples about why it may be inaccessible depending on the literature base that you're citing from. But I think that creating like a clear line for the judge to kind of identify through and kind of flow down with can be really helpful in order to kind of like set up a lot of the key arguments that you want to make throughout the debate, and can also be really helpful in terms of really making this criticism as a whole just a more solid package for being able to articulate where clearly you want the alternative to kind of point in with the affirmative, which I think is generally a lot better for setting up reasons why things like the permutation may not be able to operate. In addition to that, I think that being able to hash out how you want your alternative to interact with the affirmative is extremely important, because I think the better version of these accelerationist apps definitely want to be able to move towards a much more flexible interpretation of what their methodology can do, which means that a lot of times they want to make sure that they are like really have these kind of open avenues for being able to access like ways of really creatively understanding the permutation and kind of like making the permutation a viable option via their flexibility towards things like the future. And they kind of, I think, also want to force the alternative into having to defend a really steep and rigid version of what like the future could be. I think that in a world where you're reading a criticism that takes a more pessimistic relationship to the future, or just generally takes a more pessimistic idea about the like ability to access said future, then you obviously have a really good in route to it just being a question of like whether or not you can prove the like accessibility of futurity and like the yes or no on that question. But I think in a world where you want to offer maybe a different like version of like what the world could look like and what the future could look like than the affirmative, then you really want to be able to identify like clearly how the alternative is bringing points of contestation with the affirmative and what your like trade-off arguments are. I think against the type of accelerationist arguments, the best type of trade-off arguments are ones that are really built into how the 1AC is like maybe positioning things like technology and the inevitability of technological innovation and its necessity and how we think about like caring for the environment. I think that there are like very good arguments from various literature bases about why maybe the abolition of how we think about technology and the status quo as a whole could be good or necessary to how like we bring like a critical kind of like a restart to the way in which we think about our relationship to like the present and the future, and maybe using those as points for how you kind of like move away or refuse the possibility of being able to be encapsulated by the affirmative by kind of like fighting these like base kind of values that accelerationist theory finds like valuable in terms of its relationship or usage of things like technology and how it views technology in relationship to other types of resources. And then when I think you're maybe transitioning this into towards something that looks closer to like a counterplan or disad type of debate, I really think it's a question of like really being able to build this clear line in the sand where you're able to push in for this impact turn debate, and then being able to just clearly identify and execute an impact turn debate. I think that it's really important for you to create a stance on the impact comparison level of this debate and how you want the judge to view the question of like what the impacts that you're both kind of sitting on mean in relationship to how the judge should be evaluating which method is more effective. What I mean by this is that I think that the most effective way to do so is to create a way that the judge should kind of be framing the counterplan or the disad's like political framing of what is kind of like viable or practical versus the alternative, and trying to say that it's a question of like what can solve fastest in terms of maybe not overturning the entire like structure or resolving the full crisis of climate change, etc., but maybe what kind of creates like the most sustainable like base to work from. And I think doing that as kind of like a stepping stone to like possible other questions about transition, etc., could be really good places for you to maybe situate a lot of like where you want the debate to go down, and can also be a good place for you to have like a really clean portion of the debate that's not just spent on like whether or not like the counterplan or dissent itself is viable, but like whether or not the type of like political planning that it takes up is like good or beneficial to like the type of like future that we should be working towards. And I think like fiat as its own kind of technology definitely opens up a different way for thinking about the possibility of the future through like various specific scenarios that I think you can definitely weigh as kind of like offense that fits like very like contestably with the affirmative kind of thesis about like how we should be using debate overall. And then I think it just becomes a question of like your ability to kind of justify like the way in which the current world order is like necessary insofar as like it's already steeped to a point where we kind of like need slower transitions in order to make the future that the affirmative is saying possible. And so in that world, you have a way to articulate this counterplan or dissad in a way that it's not a question of whether or not you can just win like that the world of the affirmative is like all bad, but like whether or not the counterplan or the dissad is a necessary like consideration for how we're able to get to the type of future that the affirmative envisions, which I think can allow you a lot of tricky arguments about like why the judge should prefer the way in which you're understanding the kind of like value of these impacts, or the way that these impacts relate to the specific question of time frame, differently than a lot of the ways that these teams would want to use their impacts against other teams, which I think can maybe put them on a little bit more uncomfortable ground and give you a little bit more room to work with. Hopefully this video was helpful for you, and hopefully you'll tune into more videos that I'll be doing talking about other stuff besides accelerationism and other theories about technology and just philosophies that I think are important in debate and the upcoming water resolution as a whole. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you continue to do so.